Hello, everybody. Good evening. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight to talk about one of my favorite subjects to discuss, which is traffic safety. I have been working on traffic safety issues going way back to 2009 when I was first elected to Glendale City Council. And I will ask all of our folks who are not on the panel to make sure you're on mute, because I do think we're picking up some background noise. But again, thanks everybody for joining us. This traffic safety is a growing problem, not just in Burbank and not just in Los Angeles County or even in the state of California, but all across our nation, with deadly traffic accidents going up almost 20% in the last couple of years. That is lives who have been lost that could have been saved if we had a different approach to how we handle our traffic, vehicle codes, our own attention to detail when we drive, and even our culture that sometimes embodies people to drive recklessly. So this is a public health crisis as far as I'm concerned, and something that's all hands on deck. And I've been very privileged to be able to partner very closely with the city of Burbank over the years, as they are so committed to this issue as well. I want to thank the city of Burbank for allowing so many of your civil servants to join us tonight, and certainly to Mayor Talamantes and Councilmember Frutos for giving your evening to be with us. Now, I have worked on legislation in my 6 years in the legislature on this issue, and I'm going to take a moment and just go over a few of the bills that I have introduced and passed into law over the past few years. And then I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll begin what's kind of a free-flowing conversation. And those of you who are watching us live, please feel free to put any questions that you have or comments into the chat. We're not able to necessarily look at those ourselves, but we have staff who's monitoring the chat, who'll pass questions along to us in the last 10, 15 minutes of our program tonight. And anything that we don't have time to get to, we will try to get you an answer, and we will make sure that any comments that you put in the chat are distributed to all of the panelists so that we can hear all of your concerns and all of your suggestions. And again, I really appreciate all of you being here. So going back to my first year in the legislature, going back to 2018 in that session, I did introduce a number of traffic safety bills. I worked with the city of Burbank and the city of Glendale and the city of Los Angeles on AB 2955, which was signed into law, that authorizes the city of all of those cities to consider equestrian safety when they're conducting traffic surveys and setting speed limits within equestrian communities like the Rancho. And this meant that they had some freedom from some of the other pretty onerous regulations about how they set speed limits and other traffic codes, so that they can focus on the unique needs of traffic in an area with horses. I also introduced AB 2363, which set up a task force of stakeholders from across the state of California to look at how we can create truly safe roads for everyone. We called it our Vision Zero Fatalities Task Force. And the interest to this task force was really phenomenal. We had people wanting to join this task force from almost every city in the state of California. We had more stakeholders who wanted to join than we even possibly could host. It was held at the California Transportation Commission. It was a fully staffed and funded task force that met for over a year, that looked at data from all across the country in ways that have been successful at reducing traffic fatalities, particularly for pedestrians and cyclists, and made a set of very comprehensive recommendations for legislation, which I'm still working on at this point in introducing, including one that did pass last year that I'll tell you about in a second. Included in that group was law enforcement. The police chief from Glendale was one of the task force members, members from AAA, from walk bike safety groups from around the state, and a whole lot of other municipalities. I also put forward a bill, AB 1393, that would have had, upon the second offense of reckless driving, which is not just you roll a stop sign, but you're going egregiously fast, you're doing donuts in the middle of a street, the things that are really threatening to other people's safety, that you would have your car impounded upon the second violation. Because one of the things that law enforcement tells me in Glendale is that they're giving these tickets to the same people over and over again, and they just pay the fines. So we needed stronger types of enforcement to get people to stop doing this really unforgivable behavior on our streets. Unfortunately, that bill was vetoed by the governor, then Governor Brown. I reintroduced it the next year when Governor Newsom came into office, and unfortunately, again, it was vetoed, but I continue to work on this issue. In 2021, I did successfully pass a bill that I co-authored with Assemblymember Fong from Bakersfield. This was a bipartisanly authored bill that allowed for a court to suspend a person's driver's license for 90 days to 6 months if they're convicted in aiding and abetting or participating in a motor vehicle exhibition of speed, meaning street racing. And it also increased and made the penalties for participating in that kind of a sideshow the same as for illegal street racing, because under the old law, if you were doing an exhibition of speed with no other car, even if you're going 120 miles an hour in the street, you didn't have the same range of penalties as someone who was street racing. So this brought those two different types of reckless behavior together. This year, and then last year as well, I introduced and successfully passed a bill that's been in the news the last few days, AB 43, that was supported by my partners here in the city of Burbank and many other municipalities, that for the first time allows cities more flexibility in how they set speed limits. Not to get overly long into this, because of something called the 85th percentile, for decades, cities have been forced to raise speed limits to accommodate speeding drivers. I know that sounds crazy, but if people were getting off the 134 to cut through your community and your streets, and they were all speeding because they don't know the area or they're just late to work, in order to enforce the speed limits, the city of Burbank would have to do a traffic survey. And if everybody's speeding, what they would have to do at the end of that is raise the speed limits to accommodate them. And because of that, we ended up with a phenomena called speed creep, where over a few years, cities kept having to raise speed limits and raise speed limits and raise speed limits. This was so profound that in the city of Los Angeles, over 100 miles of roads had to have, right in residential neighborhoods, had to have their speed limits raised at the same time that traffic fatalities from speeding was going up. My bill was passed with the help again of my partners here in Burbank. And because of that, now in high injury networks or in areas with vulnerable populations, like with horses or with schools or senior centers or in busy downtowns or new bike lanes, cities are now able to not just cap speed limits, but in some cases to lower them to increase safety. So this year, I've introduced again several bills dealing with traffic safety. And now that I'm chair of transportation, I'm able to make that a main focus of all of my legislation to make sure that we weave safety into all of our transportation policy. I've introduced AB 2344, which has Caltrans find ways to set funding aside for wildlife corridors. Now, it's not just for the animals, but when you have large animals like bears in some parts of the states, or hear deer or mountain lions crossing highways, as they do, not only do those animals get killed doing it, but they can easily cause a deadly traffic accident when they're hit by cars. So this bill would create in areas with a high level of need, where we have migratory animals that are cut off by highways, safe ways of getting across that highway, connecting them. So I'm very happy to be working on that bill. I introduced a bill, AB 2336, which also institutes one of those recommendations from the Zero Fatalities Task Force, which is about using automated speed cameras in high injury networks so that we can supplement the amazing work done by our local law enforcement. And in cases where people are egregiously speeding, and this bill says you have to be going at least 11 miles an hour over the speed limit, the car would get a ticket, kind of like a parking ticket. It wouldn't go to the individual, so there's no privacy concerns, but the car would get a ticket, which, by the way, is a much lower ticket than you'd get if you were given one by an officer, and with no points in anyone's license plate, but it would get a ticket. And that money would then have to be used for safety in those very same roads. So for upgrades to the infrastructure of those roads, to do the traffic calming measures that we need to make those roads safe. And lastly, I am working on a bill 2022, which is a bike omnibus bill. We call it our Omni Bike Bill, that makes a whole series of comprehensive changes to the vehicle code to make it safer to ride bikes, and makes the laws clearer for people who are engaging in cycling in the state. And we're working with all of the bicycle coalitions in the state on that. And so with that, I appreciate you all giving me the time to just talk a little bit about what I'm working on in Sacramento. And now I would like to move to our panel to introduce themselves. And let's start with the mayor. And we are so thrilled that you and the council member have joined us tonight. Mr. Mayor, if you'd like to just give a very brief introduction. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Yes. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jess Talamantes, Burbank Mayor. Thank you, Assemblymember Friedman, for hosting this event, and thank you to the public for joining us. Traffic is one of Burbank City Council's top 7 goals for 2022, and I'm happy to see we are discussing the importance of it together, along with the Assemblymember. Safety is a top priority for the city, and we want to do what we can to make our streets safe and prevent the loss of human life. I look forward to the dialogue, and my panelists, thank you for being here as well.
Thank you so much. Council member.
Good evening. Most important, Assembly members, thank you for the dialogue. Thank you for the invitation, but most important, thank you for reaching out to the Rancho community, because this is a very, very important topic for them, is that traffic safety. So I'm really glad to be here. I retired from the Los Angeles Police Department with 28.5 years, and I'm currently a reserve officer. So traffic safety and what I can do as a legislator in the city of Burbank, I'm all ears. My sleeves are rolled up, and I'll wait for my panelist discussion to get more into it. But thank you to the community members for joining our assembly member and our mayor. And I'm really excited to be here for the conversation. Thank you, assembly member and mayor.
Okay, let's move now to Captain Cremens.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to also thank Assemblymember Friedman for the opportunity to speak. Traffic is the #1 complaint we have in Burbank. It's above crime by far. And although he will introduce himself, John Fromer, the lieutenant, is truly a subject matter expert in traffic. He'll probably be too modest to say that tonight, but I just want to set the table. I was the patrol captain for the past 6.5 years. I recently went to an administrative assignment, but I'm still very conversant with traffic issues, and I welcome the opportunity for a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. Lieutenant Fromer.
Good evening. Thank you for this invitation, Assemblymember Friedman, and thanks for putting this forum together. To our city officials and the captain, thank you. This is a very important topic that's near and dear to my heart, so I want to thank you for the engagement with the community tonight.
Thank you. And Mr. Kriske.
Good evening, everyone. My name is David Kriske. I'm the Assistant Community Development Director. I'm in charge of many of the city's transportation programs, including transit, active transportation, long-range planning, funding, pretty much everything but the actual engineering itself. I'm a planner by trade, but I'm also responsible as part of my job to interface directly with our Public Works Department, who does all the engineering behind a lot of what we do. And a lot of my job, as relevant to tonight, is really to look at the safety and engineering and planning for our streets to make sure that they are safe and accessible for all users. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And even though we are going to be talking clearly about things that impact all of Burbank and safety in all of Burbank, we are going to also talk a little bit about the unique challenges for the Rancho. I had a horse for many years that I kept at the stables on Mariposa, and have ridden all around Burbank and, over the swinging bridge and through the tunnel more times than I can count to go into Griffith Park, and have had to navigate that. And as someone who's owned a horse now for 25 years, and since I've been in LA, but also my entire life as a young person and a child and a teenager, I know how challenging it can be and how difficult it is to mix horses with their walnut-sized brains and very large bodies and cars. So that's why I wanted to focus a little bit on the Rancho, because those of you who are riding in the area know that you have some challenges that other people who are driving around you may not appreciate, or biking around you may not appreciate. So that's why we decided to focus it a bit on this area. So, Mr. Mayor, you've been with the city for quite a long time and watched this issue evolve over the years. I'm wondering how you'd rate the progress that we have made towards safer streets, and what changes you would like to see in Burbank or at the state to help facilitate safer streets for everybody.
Thank you. Yes, excellent question. A lot of food for thought there. You're right. I've been in Burbank for a long time, and I retired from the Burbank Fire Department after 33 years. So I got to see a lot of changes within the community. Some that were good and some that were not so good. But the Rancho is a special place. We do have a special place in Burbank, obviously with the horse ownership. And there's not too many communities that can say that. Even though the traffic situation not only impacts the Rancho, it also impacts the entire community. But Burbank is absolutely supports a goal of zero fatalities. Most fatal collisions are preventable, and no one should lose a loved one to a preventable tragedy. I believe all community stakeholders, and that's the big part. We have to bring in the stakeholders, need to be involved in the endeavor to reduce traffic speeds and change the driving culture, like you mentioned earlier, Assembly member, to focus on safety principles. So when does that start? You got to start from a young age, right? You got to set the foundation, and it's got to start in the schools. It's got to be engaged as they grow older, and when they reach the age of getting their driver's license, traffic permit, driving permit. I think we have to continue, not only stop there, but I would like to have some kind of 1 or 2 hour mandatory before you graduate. Because you can get your driver's license or your permit at 15 and a half, 16 years old. You graduate at 18, so it's been 2 years since you've been having driving ed courses. So before you graduate, I'd like to see a 2 hour mandatory curriculum to make it able to graduate. It's just tell them one more time and tell them again, right, as they get older. Because we're finding out there's too many problems with younger kids with faster cars, right? I mean, everybody press the metal to the pedal, and the cars are faster. And one of the things about traffic that I've always mentioned, the fact that I'm part of the problem. When I was growing up, we had 4 members of the family. How many cars did we have? We had 1, right? When I was younger, high school age. And then as we grew older, I've got 5 members in my family now. How many cars do we have? 5 cars. So we went from 1 in a family of 4 to 5 cars in a family of 5. So I'm part of the problem as well. So I want to be part of the solution. So you'll hear throughout this conversation that traffic safety requires a multi-pronged approach of education, enforcement, and engineering. So over the last few years, Burbank ranked the best for overall traffic safety within comparable cities. So I'm glad to see my colleague, Councilmember Frutos, here to share his thoughts with us as a retired police officer. And obviously the two gentlemen, the captain and the lieutenant, they're here that can share their thoughts and what they see on a daily basis. Thank you, Madam Assembly Member.
Thank you. Councilmember Frutos, you do have a unique perspective, having been in law enforcement yourself and now making policy. So kind of working on both sides of this issue. And I know that you made this issue one of your top priorities going into the year. And so I'm wondering how I'll sort of ask you the same question. How's Burbank doing? What would you like to see done differently or done better? And what suggestions you have for us to help support you?
I'll start from the historical part. So going back to August 31st of 1990, under the leadership of Councilmember and Mayor at that was Michael Hastings, the Burbank City Council, it's pretty interesting with your assembly bill, which I'm really thankful for that assembly member, is the Burbank talked about the Rancho and the speed, and the city took a bold initiative back in 1990 to say from 35 to 30 miles per hour. That took effect back on October 6th. And this was dated, obviously, August 31st, 1990, in the Burbank Leader, written by Richard Swearinger of the Daily News staff team. So the issue for the Rancho has only continued to grow, and that bothers me because our population and size has grown. And if we look at the uniqueness of the Rancho community, Riverside is now a major street that's used to cut through traffic that Waze will dump people off the 134 freeway. And when you add our city on-street trails for equestrians to cross Riverside and then cross Main Street for access to and from Griffith Park, I really would like to see some type of, using your bill now, to really reduce the speed. And then now I'm going to be weighing in harder on David Kriske to see where we're at with our complete streets that I should be getting behind in legislatively supporting to reduce the traffic, because as our population is still continued to grow and there's future development that's going to come into the Rancho community area, I really, have to think outside the box. And when we have a park with picnic grounds, baseball courts, we have the international school between 300 and 400 students that go there, 2 restaurants, base camps, Vivas, and we have between Glendale and Burbank, because I also want to include Glendale, 5 commercial equestrian centers. As a police officer, I'm looking at the volume of traffic. What I need legislatively with your support from Sacramento is there some type of law that we can hold our district attorneys for filings? Can we hold our judges accountable that says, hey, if there's a horrible accident, there's no questions. This is how you have to file. Because what I have seen as a police officer, especially after all the protests 2 years ago, now they don't even want police officers to write citations. These are the real issues police officers are confronted on a daily basis. What the people in the Burbank community have communicated to me, and I know to the mayor, is, hey, we want cops on motorcycles stopping people and writing tickets. We want to see squad cars. We don't have enough officers to do that, but with the surplus that we have in Sacramento, is there any way we can get special funding with specific traffic enforcement? Because what I've learned being a police officer is nobody wants to get a ticket. And when people see that officers are doing a task force of citations between these hours based upon data, it sends a strong message. That's the type of support I believe right now we need. But we got to hold the district attorneys accountable, and we got to hold the judges. And we really, as a community through Sacramento, look at, are we really preventing officers from really doing their job? I know we're trying to be sensitive. Like, we lost the power to impound vehicles because we didn't want to hurt the mom and dad that need the car the next day to go to work. And I understand that. But the reality is it's so out of control right now that we really need some tough laws, or at least look at the current laws that we have and make these DAs and judges accountable that you have to do this. You can't look the other way. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Captain Cremens, so kind of going off on what the council member just suggested, do you think that we need to somehow improve the enforcement of our current traffic laws? Are the DAs not following through enough with some of these, some of the violations that you're writing? And I'm wondering if, this is probably going to get myself in hot water asking this, never ask a question where you don't know the answer. But what do you think of my bill about the automated speed enforcement option for communities in certain areas?
Okay, well, let me answer that one first. We're very strong proponents of technology, and we try to harness it wherever we can. And we've done that in a number of ways within the police department. So especially for traffic, if you have something that's a comprehensive automated system that's going to be equitable, it kind of takes the human factor out of it. And you're not relying upon observations of police officers. You're not relying upon having officers deployed at that particular time, because we're very sensitive to what goes on in the Rancho. However, we have an ethical obligation to police the entire city, not 17 and a half square miles. I don't know how many street miles there are, but it's substantial. And almost every neighborhood you talk to, they think they're the only ones that have a speeding problem or whatever. I think what we really have is a societal values problem, because driving behavior is a reflection of your personality and your values. And I think what the mayor was talking about having early intervention in education. And we've been taking some steps in that direction. We just, the police department is in the process right now of initiating a partnership with BUSD in driver education and really focusing on that. I think, as you all know, we had a multiple 3 fatality, back on August the 3rd. It was a horrific accident up on Glen Oaks. And as a result of that, we've really kicked up enforcement effort, and we have a lot of community support behind that. So that it kind of dovetails with what Councilmember Frutos was speaking of. So as a police officer, I try not to get political. I think in concept, technology is great, but I will leave it to, first of all, I think community support would be critical. And I'll leave it to the political leaders for public policy decisions as far as, fiscal impacts and, how it's going to be paid for and, management of information. Any system you bring on board, we have body worn cameras as an example. And it sounds great, but that's like the tip of the iceberg. Below, you've got all the maintenance issues, you've got the discovery requests that come with it, and hiring people to manage that. So that's a whole other conversation. But to answer your question, Assemblymember Friedman, I really welcome any type of automated system that it really takes the human error element out of it, and it documents and for lack of a better term, nails behavior right there. And as they say, justice delayed is justice denied. You get a ticket in the mail right away. And as you pointed out, you don't get points or whatever, but I think it will impact behavior. But we try to do a traffic analysis. We do it all the time, where the hotspots are. We respond to citizen complaints. We track each one of them. We send a motor officer out there, talk to the complainant, and then we work the problem until we have a resolution to it and we're able to report back. Plus, we go out to as many community events as we can and try to really educate people, because everybody looks at cops and think, enforcement's the answer. And that's one of 2 tools. The other thing is education. And I look at that as prevention. I would much rather prevent crime or bad traffic behavior than try to correct it after the fact through citations. And let's face it, you're reaching into somebody's pocketbook. I'm not worried about being unpopular if you're going to save lives, but if you can get voluntary compliance through, good values, through education early on, being a polite driver instead of everybody's got an emergency, they want to get there fast. And like the councilman pointed out, you got ways rather, that's not helping us. But we try to go to as many community events and use that as an opportunity to instill these traffic safety principles. On just a smaller level, we just added 2 motor officers to the squad, and we have a driving under the influence car that's dedicated solely to DUI enforcement and traffic enforcement. Generally, we're trying to make subject matter experts out of a couple of our officers as a career path. So Lieutenant Fromer can give you more insight into that because he supervises them directly. But in whole, that's our approach. As far as you can always improve, that's one of our core values. Quality through continuous improvement. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that perspective, and the education is certainly an important part, as is engineering. But when it comes to reckless driving and the type of really aggressive driving that we're seeing, I think that we need to think of this in terms of a culture change. We need to really change the culture around how people drive. The accident that you referred to on Glen Oaks that happened several months ago, that was devastating. That was a really devastating accident. 3 innocent young people just starting their lives with all the promise in the world and having those lives cut short for no reason. A lot of people who work in the traffic safety space are now talking about removing the term accident from events like that, because that was not an accident. That was wholly preventable. There's a book called There Are No Accidents. And it talks about how so many things that we call accidents, like what happens with traffic, are systemic. They're systemic issues, and we know how to solve them. It's just that we have lacked, in many cases, the will to really think of these as public health crises. I would say if we have as many people dying in this nation as die every single day on the roads, if they were that many people dying in plane crashes, we would ground our fleet immediately. If we had one day with that kind of carnage in the skies, we would have grounded every single airplane. And yet we've come to accept these deaths as some kind of collateral damage that's unavoidable. And I believe that it's almost completely avoidable if we put our minds towards better technology to prevent into safety for vehicles, designing vehicles that are safer for people on bikes and in cars, which can be done, towards that culture change, the education, towards the engineering on our roads, which of course takes resources, but that's our part. Councilmember Frutos, you're right. We should be supporting you at the state to do these things. And I'm happy to try to do that. And I've been trying to work with funding in the state and formulas in the state to give you the resources you need to really look at your roads and engineer them with safety in mind for all the users of the road, because you need that physical infrastructure as much as you need the education and as much as you need the enforcement. It needs to be looked at holistically. All right, I'm going to get off my high horse. I'm sorry, I get really passionate about this. I want to see if the lieutenant has anything to add on the enforcement side or on any side. Oh, you're on mute as well.
There we go.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Assembly Member, but just to speak from the enforcement side, we're seeing some aggressive and dangerous driving behavior that's carried over from the pandemic. So with less drivers on the road, a lot of people were taking some chances that you typically wouldn't see pre-pandemic. And also people at home were trying to find some hobbies, and the car culture here in California and here in America goes back many, many decades. We have a special relationship with our cars. It seems like the car culture kind of exploded and expanded quite a bit over 2020 and 2021. So we are seeing some dangerous speeds out there. And unfortunately with that comes an increased risk of severe injuries if you're involved in a collision. And the captain and you have already touched on the tragic fatal collision that we had in August of last year. So what we'd like to do is we're getting out there in a two-pronged approach with education and enforcement. As the captain mentioned, we want to reach young drivers before they ever get behind the wheel. You will see us in our local high schools teaching these courses and teaching basic safety principles and the reason behind it, which is to save lives and keep us all safe, which we all have a right to be on our roadways. And then we are going to increase our social media presence. We want to put on more presentations and welcome the public and our community to actually come to the police department, get to know the officers that are on the road, the spirit that's behind the safety principles that we teach, and understand when we're giving citations that there's a good purpose and a good reason behind it. We do take safety personal, being in the traffic bureau and motor officers. This is what we do for a living, and we don't want to relive what we did last year. So you will see an increased presence from us. You will see us working. I know you've spent several years in Glendale working hard as a champion for traffic safety. So you will see us partnering with them and Pasadena, our sister cities, to actually put on more educational campaigns as well as a task force, if you will, to work these problematic areas that kind of along the borders between our cities. So you will see us out there promoting safe driving.
That's great. Thank you. And I'd like to shift gears a little to that physical infrastructure, because that is, at least if not more important than the enforcement side. And that means the type of road design and landscaping that can lead cars to speeding, even if they don't realize it, or slow them down. So Mr. Kriske, can you talk about the physical infrastructure side and how the Rancho figures into the Complete Streets program, and also some of the work that the city of Burbank has done so well to connect our bike paths to protect cyclists with the Chandler Bike Path and the Burbank Wash and the LA River, and how that all connects. We have a lot of cyclists who go through the Rancho, go through Burbank to get to Griffith Park. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you think needs improvement and what the future holds for this kind of transportation planning.
Yes, I'd be happy to. And I'll start first generally with the city with Complete Streets, and then I'll focus down a little bit onto the Rancho specifically. So as we've been talking, the idea around Complete Streets is really simply to make sure that our streets are providing safe travel for all users, not just one segment of the population, but of all users and for all ages and abilities. So our roads in the past have been designed for efficiency of cars, for throughput of cars, for convenience of cars. And that's still a value because that's predominantly how we get around in our city and in this country. However, at the same time, there needs to be a balance with how we provide safety for those who choose to travel via other means. And that can be simply folks who are walking, taking a walk after work and walking with their families, or riding a bike or taking transit. One thing that the city council did, I think was very important in that regard, is in 2020 adopted our citywide complete streets plan. It was an outgrowth of our general plan, and it really sets the standard now for how we build and rebuild our street infrastructure to ensure that it's being safe for all users. We have several projects in the plan. We have several guidelines and policies in that plan, and it really gives us a city now as a roadmap to how we build our street infrastructure so that it does have those values. And the staff now is implementing that plan in a few ways. The council directed us to implement 3 specific early action projects, which we're working on now. We are integrating those policies and programs in our specific plans and our land use planning, so that as we update these land use plans, we're integrating our complete streets as part of it. And then we're also integrating complete streets in the review of all development projects. So now development projects have to be mindful of ensuring they are doing their part to integrate complete streets, and then funding that as well. So that's what we're doing on a citywide basis. In terms of the Rancho specifically, the complete streets plan does have a equestrian chapter. And the one thing that it does do is it designates most of the streets in the Rancho district as equestrian priority streets. And so it's acknowledging that while we're balancing all modes, we're acknowledging the individual and unique needs that equestrians need in that area. And that resolves around separation where we can from other types of travel. And when the equestrians do interact with travel, such as at an intersection, we have means for them to cross more safely. So that's things, as I think was mentioned earlier, making sure that pedestrian push buttons are also provided at horse level so that riders can push them easily. There is a specific project in the Complete Streets plan to improve the equestrian connection from the Mariposa Horse Bridge up Mariposa on a separated bridle path to get up to Riverside and then expand into the neighborhood. That's a project that was identified as part of our outreach. And then any of the other traffic calming pedestrian improvements that are prescribed in the Complete Streets plan to slow traffic and help pedestrians and bikes and other users also applies to equestrians as well. So we're separating and slowing traffic throughout the Rancho. And an interesting side note that the Councilmember Frutos was mentioning about early efforts in the Rancho in terms of speed limits on Riverside. The Rancho in Burbank is also the interesting place where we did our first what is called sometimes a road diet, where you take travel lanes and you convert them into other uses. We did that in the Rancho a long time ago, I think the early mid-90s, before it was fashionable in the transportation circle. So we've been at the vanguard in Burbank in some of these things, and particularly it was interesting to note that the Rancho was at the head of their time in taking control of Riverside Drive and calming it for reducing traffic and cars, but also to calm it for everyone. Pivoting quickly to some other plans we have for the active transportation networks throughout Burbank connecting to the LA River, the council is also directed us to pursue some capital projects to take Chandler Bikeway, which everybody loves to use in Burbank, and expand that amenity to connect it throughout the city. And so we've got several projects to extend Chandler to the downtown Burbank Metrolink station, and then to extend Chandler to connect to the recently opened Burbank Channel Bikeway, which goes along the Burbank Wash between the Metrolink station and the city of Glendale. That was opened in 2021 and is now open for use. And then in partnership with the city of Glendale and the city of Los Angeles, they have projects programmed through Metro to extend that same facility over to the LA River. So not only in Burbank, when these projects are done, will you be able to have a Chandler-like experience across a major portion of the city with this expanded separated bike path network, but you'll be able to connect to the LA River directly. You'll be able to do it in a way that's not necessarily in the Rancho. So right now, a way to get into Griffith Park across Mariposa Bridge, you're not supposed to do. And there's always a tension with the equestrians getting into Griffith Park with the bikes. We're creating a direct path away from that's very high quality, separate, very safe to get you right into Griffith Park in a way that's separate and completely apart from cars. And that's something that I'm excited to work on. It's something we hear a lot about in terms of how can we make Chandler-like amenities. We call them 8 to 80 facilities. Whether you're age 8 to age 80, you feel comfortable walking or riding on them. That's something we're pursuing. It's something that the mayor has been working in terms of Chandler Extension for, I think, as long as he's been on the council. And so we're very excited to move those projects into design and construction.
That's great. I am so proud and grateful of what Burbank is doing and their commitment towards complete streets. It's really wonderful, and I think a model for all of the cities. And I will put a little brag for the funding that I was able to secure in the last few years for Glendale to build a pedestrian and bicycle bridge from the end of the Glendale Narrows Riverwalk project, which is accessible from the Rancho, over the bridge into Griffith Park by the zoo and the soccer fields. Most importantly, because that will connect cyclists to the LA River bike path. And from that, you'll be able to bicycle safely soon when they finish the LA portion all the way into downtown Los Angeles, and actually along the LA River to Long Beach. If you're that buff, you'd be able to ride your bike all the way from Burbank along a protected bike path to get all the way to Long Beach and to the beach. So there's a lot of exciting things happening out there. I want to turn to some of the questions that we've gotten from some of the residents. Scott wrote that he lives on Riverside Drive, right near the bowling center, and it can take him sometimes 10 to 15 minutes to get in or out of his driveway on Riverside because of the volume of cars and because of what's happening at Disney from 2 to 1 lanes is backing the traffic up. And he is wondering if it is possible to divert traffic from Riverside at Buena Vista up to Alameda or beyond. And if there's any way for the city to look into encouraging drivers to not cut through the Rancho. And I don't know who wants to take that. Anybody who wants
I like to start. I like to weigh in on that. It's a great suggestion. We have to turn to a traffic engineer for that. You know, they have to go through studies. They've got certain requirements that they have to go through. You got to check off certain boxes to see if the need or the requirement of the ask is there, because we have to abide by all state laws, obviously. And that's where I get into more local control. If the state could give us more local control, just like AB 43 does, we'd be great. I mean, we could make more decisions on our own instead of having to always look to the state for approval.
Anybody else want to comment on whether that's something the city is able to look at trying to do to help out those residents?
I hate to put Mr. Kriske on the spot, but this goes back to our complete streets. And I really would like to hear on behalf of the people what we're doing as a city.
Sure, I'll try to answer that. And again, you don't have a magic solution for a lot of these things. A lot of what we do is trade-offs. So just as I said that we reduced Riverside way back in history to 1 lane to slow people down and kind of discourage Disney commuters from using Riverside, the side effect is now we have congestion during times of the day when the cars that are there are going slower, and now it's harder for folks to get out of their neighborhood. So I totally understand it. And a lot of what we do has trade-offs, and that's part of why we're here today, is we're trying to talk through those trade-offs and figure out where we land in terms of safety versus convenience versus accessibility. That being said, I would say, without getting into specifics in trying to fix that specific problem, I would say our strategy is where we're restricting traffic on streets like Riverside, we're trying to also prevent that congestion from going into the neighborhoods. And by that, we use neighborhood protection plans to do that. And we have a neighborhood protection plan underway just now in the Rancho Providencia neighborhood, which is just north of the Rancho. But we also have a longstanding Rancho neighborhood protection plan that was put in many decades ago. And so we would potentially look at looking at that plan and seeing if it could be updated. The other strategy we have is to encourage folks to stay out of Riverside. We want to put them on Buena Vista and Alameda, like was suggested. So in that case, the council has invested in traffic signal technology to coordinate those larger streets so that they are attractive rather than using the residential and the local streets instead. Again, we can adjust it so we can have it tuned up so that we get lots of green lights during the peak periods when traffic is congested and slow. But when traffic is light and fast, such as later in the evening, we don't want to see a wall of green. And so what the council asked us to do out in Glen Oaks, and we're going to be looking at it on other streets, is off peak. We want people to be broken up by some red lights sometimes. We don't want to see a 2-mile long stretch of green lights. We want to break it up. And so we've made a lot of investments in traffic signal technology, which can tune the streets to be fast and efficient, but we can also have intelligence to slow it down when we want to. And so now we're taking that approach to manage our arterials to make them convenient when we want them to be, but then slow when we want them to be.
That's great. I love it. We have a question from the Burbank, one of your Burbank traffic commissioners, Jason. He asked about implementing traffic barrier separations between cars and other road users, the horses and then the cyclists. And he references Alameda as particularly difficult, with cars often pulling into the bike lane to pass on the right. So he wants to know about using that physical infrastructure to curb driver dangerous behavior.
So Complete Streets Plan gets right to the meat of that issue. And yes, we have class 2 bike lanes, which are paint on the ground, and those are good. But to really make things safe and comfortable for more users, you really do need to separate them. And so the Complete Streets Plan does talk about where and when we consider those separations based on different traffic volumes and conditions. One trick again to that is the cost to really protect things properly and to retrofit our streets the way they are. It involves a lot of cost to actually move curb and gutter, to create barriers, to create pedestrian islands and that sort of thing. The Avion project on Hollywood Way is an example of the gold standard. And so that is ideally what we'd want to retrofit in other places like Alameda, but that's a high price tag. So at that point, we're looking at what other funding can we secure to make those bigger improvements. But Complete Streets Plan does talk about the situations when you put that protection in place. And yes, that is an ultimate goal, is to really separate the different users on the road to make it safer.
So you'll all be happy to know that there's $750 million in the budget this year towards active transportation upgrades and complete streets. And I've been fighting for more funding than that, because that's for the whole state. And there are other pots of funding. Safe routes to schools is one source of funding. There's other funding out there. So happy to work with you to try to get as much money as we can locally, and also to help get more of this abundant general fund money that we have to go towards safety, because it saves lives. So going back to Complete Streets, somebody else asked how Burbank residents can participate in these programs, so that how do they recommend improvements? How does a typical Burbank resident, someone who's maybe watching this, who doesn't have the mayor's cell phone number, how do they weigh in and say, we need something in our neighborhood and I want to suggest X, Y, or Z?
Sure. So the Complete Streets Plan started with outreach to set the framework, but as part of the implementation, we are constantly looking at how we're implementing and how we're doing. We're going to be starting a regular presentation with our Transportation Commission, that they can get some checkups on how we're implementing the plan. And eventually those checkups will go to council as well, as also as part of the budget review process. So certainly getting involved in the Transportation Commission is one way to do it. On more direct or maybe simpler requests that we get a lot, such as, what about a stop sign here? What about a crosswalk there? What about speed humps? I think the first point of entry should be our Public Works Department, because they handle the day-to-day evaluation of the more nuts and bolts traffic devices and respond to those requests. Sometimes it's not necessarily just, I need a stop sign, and we go out and we put it in, and why not? Because it's cheap, right? It's just signs. But there is some engineering that needs to go on to make sure that those measures are put in appropriately. And so our Public Works Department does take those in and evaluates them. Two quick things I want to mention that the council has done to help that process. They adopted in 2018 some lowered warrants for when stop signs can be installed, so that they can be installed at a more easily lower threshold and more easily. And we did that, implemented stop signs around all schools in the city as part of that. So if you do request a stop sign and we measure the conditions before putting it in, the standard is lower, so that you have a better chance of getting that in. The other thing that we're doing now that will be coming before the community is updating our speed hump policy to make it a little bit easier and to make more streets qualify for speed humps if the residents on those streets, a majority of them, wish those items to be installed. So those are two ways that you can get involved on two different types of projects or items.
Thank you. And going back to that holistic approach to traffic safety, Andre writes that the best and only long-term solution to high traffic is reducing traffic, and removing cars from the road, he writes, not only contributes to a safer environment for residents, but a cleaner environment for all. And to that end, he wants to know your opinion, council member and mayor, on an aggressive revamp of public transportation and making that a cornerstone of your efforts to reduce traffic fatalities. And I can say that that's something that I work on every single day, and I'm going to be holding a hearing in the next few weeks of the Transportation Committee in the legislature about how we can help our transit agencies attract more riders through various upgrades, safety improvements, efficiency improvements, and of course, investments. So I totally agree with you. And he's asking the council member and the mayor to weigh in on their commitment to public transportation.
You know, I'll weigh in real quick before my colleague weighs in. I'm on SCAG's Transportation Committee, and I'm a representative from Burbank on the San Fernando Valley Metro Council. So we're engaged. The conversations we're having on a monthly basis at those two other organizations, and we have it pretty much all the time here in Burbank. But how do we get people out of their cars? I mean, in California, we're born in our cars, right? I mean, pretty much forever and ever, we needed our cars to get from point A to point B. So we're doing a lot of more amenities that are increasing for example, the stops where the people go in and board the metro buses. We're trying to light them up, make it more safer, because people tended to stay away because it wasn't safe enough. So we're trying, as one member of the Metro Council, we're trying to just make it easier, user-friendly for people to use the metro buses, get out of their cars, or even go to, for example, the red line. Leave your car there and take the train into LA or wherever you're going. So, you know, there's options out there, but everything comes with a cost. And that's what we have to focus on, in spite of the fact that I know Councilmember Frutos and myself, we would love to have all kinds of new stuff, new amenities for the people that want to take advantage of those things. But it comes with a cost. Unfortunately, we're waiting for Assemblymember Friedman to give us some of those millions of dollars. So put Burbank on the list first. Thank you.
Always. Council member, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I echo where the mayor left off, that we're at the table, we're trying, but let's be real. Burbank is 17 square miles. We have 107,000 residents. The tough part for Burbank is that we swell up Monday through Saturday with 150,000 more jobs, people that come to work here. And when we're separated by two freeways and the cut through traffic, realistically, if you look at the Burbank bus, and I go back and forth and the mayor goes back and forth, our buses are empty. Councilmember Springer is always trying to promote the bus and she takes people on tours. But the reality is, until people are also willing to take an investment in public transportation, then we can do all the policies, get all the buses out there, but people need to look at, hey, you know what, instead of taking the car, yeah, I'm going to get up an hour earlier. But with the pandemic and the homeless situation, as a police officer, sometimes our disadvantaged folks will use the red line as their shelter. And people, we've seen incidents that they don't want to deal with that, or we're starting to hear people getting robbed in our subways. So there's also a public safety component to reassure people going to work that it is safe to take public transportation. But I know myself and the rest of the council, through the leadership of our mayor, hey, we are willing to do whatever we can to aggressively pursue it. That's reasonable, but it's really also the community that has to get out of their car. And that's what we're trying to do. Just look at our bike pass that we've done. We bring it, but they're not utilized 100%. It's only a small portion that will use the bike pass. So no, we are very committed, but we need the support of the people to start using public transportation. I hate seeing the Burbank Blue Bus empty.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And
Thank you.
Absolutely. The safety on public transportation is key. And it's been a topic of a lot of discussion. I know in LA with LA Metro and across the state. And something that you said, I think, is very telling, of somebody getting up an hour early to take the bus. And that's part of the problem, right? You really want your buses to be faster and more efficient than driving, and easier. That's how you get people onto them, and certainly safe and pleasant. I have a question from my good friend, former Mayor Emily Gabeletti. It's great to kind of see you here, Emily. She wanted to know what I can do to help seek state funding for implementation of Complete Streets horse trails, and that the standards are clear, and how will I get money for horse safety? So the Complete Streets is for bicycles, pedestrians, and also for the equestrian community. It is written into the law that it's for all users of the road. And I have been working very, very hard for a number of years in many different ways to try to increase the funding that we give to Complete Streets and traffic safety to go right into municipalities, to make sure that cities like Burbank have the resources that they need to make the improvements. And they know, Mr. Kriske knows where he needs to make a lot of these improvements. The mayor knows, the council member knows. We know what horse trails are intersecting with traffic and maybe not as safe as they can be. And it's very important that you all have the resources that you need, both from whatever local funding is available and from the state. And that means reevaluating some of our old funding formulas. And that's something that I work with my team on all the time, to see how we can divert money, quite honestly, from old funding formulas to make sure that that funding has the flexibility to be used for safety upgrades and Complete Streets work. In fact, just today I sat on a hearing, Budget Subcommittee 3, which is the budget, the part of the budget process where we talk about transportation infrastructure spending. And one of the questions that I asked, and one of the things I've been working on with my team in transportation, is how we affect the budget to make sure there is more money that's set aside for Complete Streets upgrades for all users of the road, including for equestrians. So very happy to continue working with all of you and with my staff on all of those issues. Try to grab a few more questions before we run out of time. Somebody asked how we can reduce the speed in Riverside back to 30 miles an hour. It's gone up to 35 miles an hour. My guess is pre AB 43, my bill, you had to raise it because you did a speed survey. That's why I did the bill. So now that we have that tool, very quickly, are you planning to try to utilize that the way that LA did just, I think today, lowered the speed limits on about 100 miles of road? They began that process based on the bill. So are you going to do that on Riverside and in other parts of the city?
Definitely, from my standpoint, yes. If we can do it, especially now with AB 43 in place, we can go ahead and do it. LA City did it, like you said, earlier this week. They lowered for about 100 miles of streets. They lowered it 5 miles per hour. We can go ahead and do it as long as Councilmember Frutos is backing me up.
That's great.
Oh,
So
I'm
we
backing
only
you up
have another minute or
110%.
Oh, sorry. We only have another minute or two.
I
I
said
do
no.
want to tell, before I give everyone a last minute to give any last comments, that our staff is monitoring the chat and their information is also in the chat. So if you have questions you want to email to me or to anybody on this, or you want gotten to anybody on this Zoom, please take down my staff's information. You can also email me through my website, my Assembly website, and we will get you answers, and we'll make sure that any comments that you have are passed along. I want to now turn it over for any last comments from anyone on the panel. And I will just say lastly, to thank all of you for being here and taking part of this. This is part of that culture change. All of us being engaged together and committed to working on traffic safety in the Rancho and beyond is the beginning of that culture change. So your being here today is a huge step. And I want to thank Councilmember Frutos for being a great partner and for being here. Mayor Talamantes for always being, over the years, a great partner. Certainly the lieutenant and the captain and our wonderful city planner. And I'll just turn it over to all of you to make any last comments. And thanks again.
I just want to say thank you, Assembly Member. Thank you for bringing this together. And like you said, this is part of the movement forward to make our vision happen. Thank you.
Assembly member, we both talked about traffic, how passionate you are, how I am. I'm ready to jump on a plane and go walk the halls of Sacramento and get other folks involved with your legislation. I'm committed for the safety of the Rancho and the entire city. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining us. And I learned a lot and I hope you did too. And please let's all stay in touch and work together on this very pressing issue. Good night, everybody.